coming out this afternoon. I'm Kevin Smith, the chair of the History Department, and it is my pleasure to welcome and to introduce Dr. Yaron Ayalon. He is in his second year of teaching at Ball State. He is our expert on the Middle East. His research is on the Ottoman Empire and responses to disaster in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was the unit that preceded the mess that we have now. He has his PhD from Princeton University, and he'll be speaking on the U.S. and the Middle East. He'll be speaking for a while, and then at the end, there will be plenty of time for questions. When it does come time for questions, please stand up and speak out so that you can be heard. This is being recorded, and we want to make sure your question is heard by everybody. So without further ado, let me turn over the stage to Dr. Ayalon.
Thank you. Thought you only clapped at the end, after I've done something good. So far, I may not deserve it, but we'll see, I suppose. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the United States and the Middle East, but in fact, I might not mention the United States as much as I thought I would at first. So what I really want to do today is just give, we can't obviously cover everything, so what I thought I would do is I'm going to talk for something like 30 or 40 minutes about two major issues that are ongoing in the Middle East right now. One is Iraq, and the other has to do, well, Iraq and Syria. The other has to do with the Gaza crisis of last summer. And I'll make some brief comments about each, and there's obviously going to be a historical perspective to it, given the department that I belong to and what I actually do. And at the end, of course, we'll open it up to questions, and then we can really talk about anything, not only the things that I presented. So, perhaps this would be a good point to start. And today, we are looking at this area first. We're going to be talking about what's going on in Iraq and Syria. This is something that has been on the news all the time, if you've been following it, thanks to a lovely group called the Islamic State that has been attracting our attention the past summer. So let's say a few things about the general background of the situation there. Okay, so a little background about Iraq. Many of us in this room remember this guy, Saddam Hussein. Iraq in itself was governed by the presidency of Saddam Hussein, from 1979. And it always had this issue of sectarian divisions. Primarily, we're talking about three major groups that made up Iraq. In the south, we have mostly the Shi'i Islam, Shi'i Muslims. In the east and a little bit in the north, we have a majority of Sunnis. And then in the northeast, we have the Kurdish regions. These are three different sects that didn't always get along. Historically, they were not part of any one state. But the agreements of the early 20th century after World War I created, in a sense, this state and combined people of different sects and faiths into one state. And so politically, this was always challenging. The British who formed Iraq really in the late 19-teens, early 1920s, tried to make it work. There were some attempts at democracy in Iraq. It didn't really work out, and soon the country actually got into a situation of dictatorships, authoritarian regimes. 1971, we get Saddam Hussein, and he is there until the U.S. invasion in 2003 would remove him. And if we are looking at numbers, this is a tricky issue. Probably there are more Shi'is in Iraq than any other sect, but during the years of Saddam Hussein, we didn't really know that. Saddam Hussein himself, being Sunni, had a very clear interest not to show that Shi'is were the majority. So the data we have for Iraq before 2003 is a bit confusing. Probably the one good thing that Saddam did was that he kept the situation more or less calm, did not allow major sectarian violence to erupt. Of course, that was done at the great cost. But that was the situation before the US invasion. And then we come into the picture in 2003. And the pretext, of course, was that Saddam was part of this axis of evil post 9/11. He was somehow tied to elements that were risking American lives, like Al-Qaeda. He was part of this axis of evil that also included Iran and North Korea. That was the US policy in the early 2000s. The other pretext for invading Iraq was that Saddam Hussein was not only harboring Al-Qaeda terrorists, but he was also harboring or stocking weapons of mass destruction. Today we know that he might have had some of those weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons, back in the early 1990s maybe, but definitely not in 2003 when the US invaded. And in fact, not only that we know that they didn't have weapons of mass destruction because no one ever found them, but we also know that the Bush administration actually knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq before the invasion of 2003. And for various other political reasons decided to go there anyways. We all know how this ends, the removal of Saddam Hussein and the US attempt to create an alternative government in Iraq. This would be, yes, here are some examples. Basically, trying to launch a system of democratic elections by which people would come in, vote for political parties, and have their representatives govern Iraq through a parliamentary system that exists in many other countries. And it sort of worked for a while. We have some of these politicians like Yaron Ayalon, who was an Arab and a Sunni. We had Ibrahim al-Jafari, who was Arab and Shi'i, and so on. And the last prime minister who was there for quite some time, Nouri al-Maliki, who is also Shi'i, like it's not mentioned here, but that's what he is. So anyways, it worked for a while, but there was a great cost to it because sectarian violence erupts and continues to be present in Iraq for all of this time, leading US forces to stay in Iraq much longer than they originally planned, and perhaps withdraw before really all the job was done, as some people were claimed when the withdrawal happened several years ago. What really interests us is actually this guy, not the Iraqi politicians, because the real interesting story are those who try to challenge the new Iraqi order. It's not that these guys were not around before 2003, but because of Saddam Hussein's methods of cracking down on any attempts to challenge his authority, they couldn't really take any meaningful measures. But after 2003, we start seeing some of these groups emerge and launch various attacks. And this, of course, involves all sorts of fun things like blowing up buildings and cars and what we see in the movies, but this happens for real and people actually end up dead. One guy that we probably want to pay attention to is this, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. He wasn't actually Iraqi, he was Jordanian. And he grew up in the town of Zarqa, which kind of makes sense because his family is named after the town. He was, as far as we know, as a kid, he was, a bully and a thug, and he didn't really get along with too many of his friends, and, he would beat up people whenever he felt like it. But in 1989, he decided to go to Afghanistan, and the idea, of course, was that in 1999, the local Afghans were fighting the Russians. The Russians were, they had a long war that lasted for much of the 1980s in Afghanistan. And in 1989, in February of 1989, the Russians leave Afghanistan. And that was, of course, a big victory for many of those fighters who wanted to kick the Russians out. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi wanted to go there to help fight against the Russians. By the time he actually got to Afghanistan, they were already out. But he met Osama bin Laden at that point. At least that's what we believe. Okay, So that's fine, that's his journey in Afghanistan. Goes back to Jordan, starts up a new group, a new Islamist group called Tawheed wal Jihad. This group launched several attacks and ended up, landed this guy a nice position in a Jordanian prison for most of the 1990s. So he was already into these ideas of kicking the Americans out of the Middle East and kicking Israel out of the Middle East too, and using whatever measures necessary to do that. And so the US invasion in 2003, the invasion of Iraq, and the removal of Saddam Hussein was a great opportunity for this guy. So he goes there, he goes to Iraq, and he formally becomes part of Al-Qaeda, we think in 2004. And because his operations in Iraq were so successful, in a sense, his group becomes what we know is as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And all his operations, the bombing of certain mosques, Shi'i mosques usually, because Sunnis and Shi'is don't really get along too well, bombing Shi'i mosques and American targets. He carries out these operations, allegedly also a bunch of hotels in Jordan. He does all that. They're all sanctioned by Osama bin Laden. Eventually, the Americans find out where this guy is, and he's killed in an American airstrike in 2006. But the group continues to exist. For a while, they sort of go under the radar, but eventually, they emerge with new leaders. And I want to jump a few years ahead, because the guy we're really interested in right now is the next successor of Abu Mus'ab, and that would be Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. His real name, in fact, is Ibrahim ibn Awad al-Badri, but these guys oftentimes take new names when they assume such leadership positions in such organizations. So, what do we know about him? For those of you sitting in the back, maybe it's not that easy to read, and I believe I can even expand this a little bit. Okay, that's much nicer. So what do we know about this guy? Well, first of all, we had him already. He was in US custody for some time before December of 2004. He might have been there later. There's a problem with the records, so I haven't been actually be able to find until when he was in US custody. But he was in US custody in Iraq. He was released because apparently he was not posing any threat to US interests. So much for good assessments that predict the future, right? And in 2010, he becomes the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, of that group that Abu Mus'ab started several years earlier. And they continue to launch attacks against US targets, eventually, and other Shi'i targets in Iraq itself. In 2013, 3 years later, they changed their name to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. At this point, they're not yet involved in Syria, but perhaps the name sort of tells us what they were aspiring to do. They got into a dispute with another Al-Qaeda branch called the Nusra Front, Al-Nusra Front or Jabhat al-Nusra, who were operating in Syria at about the same time. This dispute led them both to appeal to the current leader of Al-Qaeda to say who is right or wrong. The current leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, said, well, we're very sorry, actually. ISIS, the Islamic State, actually has to disarm and join, their people have to join Al-Nusra Front in Syria. This guy, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, said, no, that doesn't work for me. And if you don't want us, then we're just going to operate independently. And so, really, from January 2004, Al-Qaeda denounces this organization. And that's how we really get a group that's even more extreme than Al-Qaeda. That even Al-Qaeda doesn't want to have anything to do with it. In June 2014, they announced that their name has changed to the Islamic State, and that the leader is now called Caliph Ibrahim. Now, I threw out quite a few terms here that require explanation. And for that, we're going to have to take a little detour, if you don't mind. So, let's see. I think first, we have to figure out how this all happens. What's going on in Syria and all that, and how is that related to Iraq and to the story that I was just trying to tell. Okay. This is a nice map that shows in different colors, the colors don't actually tell you anything, But what it does show is the countries where something happened related to the events that we call the Arab Spring of 2011. This is a series of demonstrations that broke out first in Tunisia and then in most of the Arab world against oppressive regimes in the Arab world. And the hope, if you read newspapers in late 2011, early 2012, late 2010, early 2011, the hopes were, of course, the creation of democracies that would replace those oppressive regimes. But it didn't really work out that way. Let's see some examples. In some countries, like Jordan and Morocco and Oman, these are the countries labeled light blue, and Kuwait also, we've seen some demonstrations which ended with reforms that the rulers have issued out, but no meaningful regime change. In places like Tunisia and Libya and Egypt and Yemen, we actually got a revolution, a real revolution with regime change, but no real democracy has evolved in any of those places yet. Tunisia had a short-lived democratic experience of 2 or 3 years, but now it's not very clear what's going to happen there. Libya, yeah, the US was involved in a NATO expedition to extract, and well, he ended up dead, Gaddafi, who was the leader of Libya for many, many years. But Libya is still under a very fierce civil war between two major factions. In Egypt, sure, the President Mubarak, the guy who was there for more than 30 years, he was ousted, and there were democratic elections, and there was even a guy who got elected in free elections, and he got to rule for 1 year until the military stepped in again. And now it's basically the old guys who are ruling Egypt all over again. Yeah. Syria is a different story. In Syria, demonstrations against the regime started like everywhere else in early 2011, but they haven't stopped yet. In Syria, those early demonstrations escalated into a full-fledged civil war. Let's take a look at what's actually going on there. So, this is a current map of the situation in Syria. Well, not so current since it changes every day, and this is from August. So, it's pretty current. And it shows us in the different areas and who is in charge of which area. The gray areas are now under the rule of the Islamic State that we mentioned before. The green areas are under the rule of this Al-Qaeda group in Syria called Al-Nusra Front. The pink areas are under the rule of the Assad regime. And then there's some other areas that are under the rule of the Free Syria Army, which is a secular opposition to the president. So what we really got here is there's a reason why I put up this list here. So Bashar al-Assad is the president of Syria. This is the guy who refuses to give up his position. And I copied this list from Wikipedia because I think it's very interesting. If you go to the Wikipedia entry, Syrian Civil War, you'll get, you know how on the side on Wikipedia you get all sorts of side information beyond the main entry, right? And this is what you'll get, the belligerents in the Syrian Civil War. And it's very confusing because there are a lot of groups involved. And the more confusing thing is that some groups, even though they don't like the Assad regime, they also don't like some of the other groups. So some groups are fighting more than one group. So it's a big mess, and we can't get into all of the details here. But what you can see from this list is indeed that the Islamic State is at war with the Assad regime, but also with the opposition. Okay, so now let's say a few more things about what's going on in Syria. Here are these guys. Jabhat al-Nusra or al-Nusra Front, these are the people who represent Al-Qaeda in Syria. They've been around since 2012. In 2013, they officially announced, and Al-Qaeda acknowledged, that they are the branch of Al-Qaeda in Syria. They have been, until recently, the most efficient opposition group to the Assad forces, much more efficient than the Free Syria Army that started everything back in 2011. Now, what's the problem here? Let's see. Back to this guy. So he doesn't like them, and he decides to withdraw from Al-Qaeda, or Al-Qaeda gets rid of him, whatever it is. Now the Islamic State is fighting also against the Nusra Front itself in Syria. Well, maybe we need to say a few more things about these guys and what they actually want. Okay, here's the most recent map, again from last month, about areas under the rule of the Islamic State in both Iraq and Syria. I have the real flag of the Islamic State here. What do they actually want, and who are these people? Well, first of all, they're fighting a number of groups at the same time. In Syria, they're fighting the Assad army, and they are fighting the Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda in Syria. In Iraq, they're fighting the Iraqi forces. They're fighting the Kurdish forces that are now pretty much independent of the Iraqi army, and they're in the northeast. And of course, they're also now in a conflict with the United States, which keeps bombing them from above. So, despite being in a situation where they're fighting so many groups, they are still doing quite well. It's a very wealthy organization. For instance, these are nice Toyota pickup trucks built somewhere here in the Midwest. Al-Nusra Front, the Islamic State has quite a few of them. That's because when the US trained Iraqi forces, the actual Iraqi army, we shipped them a lot of equipment, and that's part of the assistance that the US gave Iraq. Equipment, cars, weapons. When the Iraqi army fled from Islamic State forces in June, this last June of 2014, they took over all of this equipment. And now they're using it, and we're paying for it. So that's just great. Beyond this, there is, of course, the issue of wealth. They have conquered quite a few oil fields, and they sell the oil that they drill to anyone, even people who are their enemies, because what they care most about is making money. And they have made a lot of money. It's really now probably, out of all of the groups that the US classifies as a terrorist group, they're probably the richest one right now. They really have a lot of money, and unlike Al-Qaeda, who is always trying to hide and post all of their information on all sorts of obscure websites, these guys use mass media, they use technology, they use the internet. I'm sure many of you have seen all sorts of lovely footage of beheadings and shooting people. They do this on purpose. Pretty much almost anyone they execute, they also videotape. And then they upload it to their Twitter account and YouTube and all that, and they're very efficient in using those tools. So in that sense, they are very, very different from Al-Qaeda, and they sort of put Al-Qaeda in a position where they're no longer the masterminds of this plan to create an Islamic State, which is really what they want. What do I mean by this? This is a map of a very old empire, the Umayyad Arab Muslim Empire that lasted for about a century in the 7th and 8th century. And this is really the basic idea, the core idea of the Islamic State right now, is to recreate a state that is based on the principal values of the original Islamic State, such as this one, such as the Umayyad state. That is, many of the laws and the rules should be the same. There shouldn't be any borders between different areas. One of the main agreements that were signed during World War I is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France in 1916. That's the agreement that carved up the Middle East into the nation states that we have today. And that's the agreement that the Islamic State opposes the most. They see it as the symbol of foreign, infidel for them, intervention in the Middle East. And indeed, some of you have probably watched this Vice News report on the Islamic State that's on YouTube. If you go and watch it, there's a scene there where they actually filmed moving into Iraq. They remove a border post between Syria and Iraq as they cross the border, and they say, this is the end of Sykes-Picot. Now we are actually physically removing Sykes-Picot from the area. we are dismantling the old borders. And that's the idea, creating this new and unbelievable state. And indeed, this is an issue that's very appealing to a lot of people. It's been so appealing that, in fact, we have a lot of European citizens who are Muslim and got so excited about this idea that they have traveled to Iraq and Syria to join the Islamic State. We don't know exactly how many, but they're probably in the hundreds. If you wonder how come suddenly many of their videos you see people speaking English with a British accent, you see someone who looks like a jihadist, but he speaks English with a British accent, or speaks French fluently. Yeah, that's all of these European supporters who just traveled, left their homes in Western Europe, and traveled to Iraq and Syria to support the Islamic State in their struggle of creating a new state led by a functionary, one leader called the Caliph. Caliph is the position that was created after the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, died. There were no other prophets. Someone had to lead the community, and therefore they appointed someone who would be the replacement of the Prophet in leadership, not in prophecy, of course, and that title was the Caliph. So the Caliphs were the rulers of this early state and other early Islamic states, and so that is the title that the current leader of the Islamic State has chosen for himself. Okay, so this is so far the very, very brief introduction to who these guys are, and we'll talk more about them because now we need to move to the other part of the story. And there's some relationship between them. We might get to that. Okay, so this summer we had a huge thing going on in Gaza, a military operation. It's not the first military violent operation or war between Israel and Palestinians, and it's not even the first one between Israel and Hamas. So let's talk a little bit about this. Okay, so all right. Here's some information about where this took place. The Gaza Strip is a really tiny strip of land on the southwest part of Palestine/Israel. It borders Egypt on the south and Israel on all the other sides. And of course what I put up here is not entirely accurate, but I didn't have too much space, so let me explain. The Gaza Strip, since the creation of Israel in 1948, was actually under Egyptian rule. It's the Egyptians who governed that area up to 1967 when, as part of a war that we'll talk about in a minute, Israel captured that territory. At this point, most of the inhabitants of Gaza were actually Palestinian refugees who left Palestine in 1948 and settled there either in the cities and towns or in actual refugee camps where many of them are still living today. So after that, Israel was directly governing Gaza, including military headquarters of Israeli army within the city of Gaza itself, all the way till 1994, until there was an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians that allowed the evacuation of Gaza. After this evacuation, it was not a full evacuation at first, because even though Israeli forces were not stationed within the main cities, the main Arab Palestinian cities of Gaza, there were still Israeli settlements in the Gaza Strip. They're not on this map because they don't exist anymore, but they were there in between. Many of them were in fact surrounded by Arab towns and villages. And of course the cost of securing them and protecting them was prohibitive, but Israel continued to do it from various ideological reasons until in well, I should have said 2005, I don't know why I say 2004 over there. Until in the summer of 2005, in August of 2005, Israel decides unilaterally to just pull out all of its settlements from Gaza and give rule to the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority. Of course, the trick here was that Israel still maintained control of all of the checkpoints, so one could not just easily come and go from the Gaza Strip. And Israel still continued to have air superiority, so Palestinians couldn't actually fly out of there. And Israel also controlled the water. So Palestinians could fish very close to the shore, but couldn't really sail out of the Gaza Strip elsewhere. And this, of course, becomes more and more the conditions of what at first wasn't a full-fledged siege. This has become a full-fledged siege after 2007. And I'll fill you in on the details in a minute. But after 2005, technically, the Palestinians have been governing the day-to-day affairs of people living in the Gaza Strip itself. Okay. We need to go a little back here to understand how we got even to this situation. So, I thought quite a bit about how to talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict in about 3 or 4 minutes. That's challenging because whatever I'm going to say, some of you is very likely to ask me about an element that I didn't say. And that's fine. Please feel free to challenge me about this. So I picked what I thought were the main events. And one of them, of course, is the war in 1948. So essentially, this war is an escalation of a process by which Jews were settling Palestine from the late 19th century, and Arabs in Palestine opposed the settlement of Jews and the creation of a Jewish state there. Most of the actual active violent conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine happened from 1920, from the years of the British mandate in Palestine. The British, after World War I, got a mandate from the League of Nations to govern Palestine, and they were there, and they weren't very happy about it, and eventually, after several attempts, they go to, first the League of Nations, but after World War II, to the new established United Nations and say, look, we can't govern Palestine anymore, we need another solution. The UN solution, known as Resolution 181 from November of 1947, was that the land is to be divided into 3 principal areas. That's the map you see on the left. 3 principal areas. 1, a Jewish state, and that would have been the blue areas. 2, an Arab state. They didn't call it Palestinian at the time, just an Arab state. That would be all the yellow parts. And an international region around Jerusalem, because maybe they understood these are holy places and it's better that those 2 people don't fight it out around them. But anyways, what happens after this decision is the part where historians dispute quite a bit. There's great debate. In essence, yes, the Jews in Palestine, their leadership accepted this proposal, and the Palestinian leadership rejected it. That's the principal fact, but what we do know is that there were clear Israeli intentions to go and pursue further land beyond what the UN has given Israel, and we also know that there were voices within Palestinian society that actually supported this resolution and wanted to see the creation of an Arab state. And we also know that the neighboring Arab countries had no interest in creating another independent Arab state, and they would have invaded anyways to grab that land for themselves. So it's a very complicated story. The end result is that indeed Israel takes more land. As you can see, all the land in purple on the map on the right belongs to all of this territory that was taken by Israel in the War of 1948. And that war, which actually ends in early 1949, it results in the creation of what is called the Palestinian refugee problem. And Palestinians have a term for this. It's called al-Nakba, the disaster. It resulted in the killing, but mostly in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees from their homes, Palestinians who then became refugees, leaving their homes. Numbers range from 400,000 or 500,000 to over 1 million. It depends on who you read and who you ask. At the end, this problem happens. Those Palestinian refugees are settled in various refugee camps all over the Middle East and also in Palestine itself. So that's how the conflict begins. It really continues, of course. I'm jumping several steps here, but in the Six-Day War of 1967, when Israel went to war against 3 separate armies in 3 different fronts, against Egypt and Jordan and Syria, the same order as the maps from left to right. And at the end of this war that lasts 6 days, hence the name, it manages to increase its territory by quite a bit. But the main interesting story for us is not the Sinai Peninsula that Israel took from Egypt and later returned as part of a peace treaty. and not the Golan Heights that you see here on the right, the area that Israel took from Syria, and well, right now there isn't really who to negotiate with in Syria, so we'll see how that goes. But the main story for us today is, of course, the middle map, the capture of the West Bank, and also the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian territories. Suddenly, something like 2 million Palestinians fall under Israeli rule. And now the question is, well, so what's going to happen next? Well, okay. Up to 1973, most of the wars that Israel had were conventional wars against other Arab countries, Egypt and Syria. But the main adversary that emerges after 1967 is really the Palestinians, represented by the Palestine Liberation Organization, of which Yasser Arafat was the chairperson. This was the one thing that I need to say about the PLO. The PLO was really an umbrella organization for a number of Palestinian groups. The largest of these groups was Fatah, which was also led by Yasser Arafat. But there were a number of other groups under the umbrella of the PLO, some of which carried out various operations against Jewish and Israeli targets, including the 1972 Munich massacre and the Olympic Games, and various other attempts to raise awareness for the Palestinian question. And in fact, they were quite successful in that, because the world really didn't think at all about the Palestinian problem before the late 1960s. By 1974, Arafat himself is invited to the UN to give a speech, and the PLO gets recognition as the representative of the Palestinian people. There would be constant clashes between Israel and people associated with the PLO, Fatah operatives and others. And eventually, this would lead to a large-scale military operation and war that would last way too long. Starts in Lebanon in 1982. Israeli forces get all the way to Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, manage to get Arafat, whose headquarters were in Beirut at the time, to leave Lebanon for good. And the idea was, we get rid of Arafat and then we have no more problems with Palestinians in the Middle East. Here's where Israeli decision makers made the same kind of mistakes that many times US administrations have made, which is, we get rid of our threat, but we don't really think what's going to happen once we get rid of our threat. Maybe something a lot worse is going to happen. Maybe we'd rather have this guy around than whoever is going to come instead. That's a point to think about. Arafat and his men leave. They station in Tunis, that's quite far away, and from there they direct the first popular uprising of Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, known as the First Intifada. It lasts for about 6 years, at the end of which there is intensive negotiations between Israel and the PLO. For the first time, in fact, Israel recognizes the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO recognizes Israel's right to exist. This is probably the most famous picture out of this entire process, the signing of the Declaration of Principles in the White House some 21 years ago. The Declaration of Principles, in fact, wasn't a peace deal. It was just sort of a basic treaty that was there to sort of set the framework for future negotiations, and there were a number of other agreements down the road. At the end, though, that peace process collapses, and it collapses for several reasons. One, of course, on the Israeli side, is it's really the assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was the big supporter of the peace process, and the coming to power of his political rival Benjamin Netanyahu. That's the same guy who is the Prime Minister of Israel now, but this is in his previous political career. In between, he had the gap of a few years where he gave lectures for $60,000 a lecture. And so this is him, a young Benjamin Netanyahu, on a campaign poster from 1996. So the coming to power of Netanyahu halted the peace process, but this wasn't the only reason why it happened. The other reason is that in 1987, when the First Intifada broke out, there was also another group that started competing with the PLO for the hearts and minds of Palestinians, and that group was Hamas. Hamas, the acronym in Arabic stands for Islamic Resistance Movement, was formed in 1987. It's an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, it's part of the same movement. It was formed by this guy, Ahmad Yassin, who is no longer with us. His wheelchair was targeted by an Israeli airstrike in 2004. But he forms Hamas as really an alternative to the PLO. The PLO and the main movement within it, Fatah movement, is a secular movement. It wants to see a Palestinian state that would be relatively secular, whereas Hamas wants to see an Islamic Palestinian state. The other major difference, of course, is that Fatah recognizes Israel's right to exist and understands that, or claims at least, that the only way to end the conflict is through negotiations, whereas Hamas publicly calls for the destruction of Israel and hasn't changed that part of its platform yet. Publicly calls for the destruction of Israel, for killing Jews, and for continued resistance until all the Jews leave Palestine and Palestine gets its independence. So these are in a very sort of quick way the differences between those movements. The collapse of the peace process in the late 1990s led to the second Intifada, the second popular uprising, where even Fatah operatives who technically recognized Israel participated in various atrocities, blowing up buses and cool things like that. But of course, Israel retaliated in operations that led to nearly the complete collapse of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is the new body that was formed as part of the agreements between Israel and the Palestinians. It was essentially run by Fatah people, and Arafat was the head of the Palestinian Authority. So now he was not only head of a Palestinian faction, but technically also the official head of the Palestinian state to be. But now it nearly collapses in another cycle of bloodshed. All right. One other reason why we don't have a solution yet is that throughout this time, and it still goes on, and no matter under which Israeli government, from the left or from the right, Israelis continue to settle in the territories conquered in the West Bank. This is a map that I can enlarge it quite a bit, in fact, and show you. Let's see how big we can get. It runs bigger than that, I'm telling you. This is a map that actually shows you the different Palestinian settlements, Jewish settlements. The purple ones are Jewish settlements within Palestinian areas. And as you can see, the situation right now is that Israeli and Palestinian settlements are quite intertwined in the West Bank. The Palestinians claim that with the presence of Jewish settlements, there's no territorial continuity for their future state, and that's really one of the major issues. We can talk more about that if you wish. Okay. So finally, back to Gaza. All right, this is how we got to the present conflict, and this is where I'm going to end because I've already spoken too much. Hamas, the rival of Fatah, takes over Gaza in a coup, essentially, in 2007. Kicks out Fatah people from Gaza, takes over Gaza, and starts administrating that area. Remember, Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. Now, it's not clear and it's disputed who started shooting first, but at the end, what we see is a trickle and then a wave and then another trickle of rockets, mostly homemade rockets, from Hamas shot into towns in the south parts of Israel. The first time Israel decides to retaliate is in December of 2008, and there have been two other cycles of this conflict directly between Israel and Hamas. By the way, when these conflicts are going on in the West Bank, that's governed by Fatah, it's usually quite quiet. Fatah people are not big fan of Hamas, and therefore when these conflicts take place, they usually, you don't hear too much of them. I got a nice image here of a rocket being launched from the Gaza Strip. And this is how we got to the last conflict again. Israel says, well, you started shooting first, and Hamas said, no, it's you guys, you assassinated this guy, or you shot at us, so we retaliated. And this goes on, and I really don't see a very clear solution to this cycle of accusations. But at the end, what do we have? The last Israeli claims, and this is where I'm going to end. Israel poses several claims or reasons for why it actually went to war this time around, this summer. One is that Hamas actually dug tunnels to infiltrate Israeli settlements. This part of the evidence is actually true. It was corroborated by foreign journalists as well, who got to visit those tunnels. This is just an example of one of those tunnels, dug from the Gaza Strip into Israel to potentially launch an attack at some point in the future. It argues that Hamas launches rockets from within civilian populated areas. This is an accusation that Hamas has denied. It argues again that Hamas uses the people of Gaza as human shields, meaning we shoot from a school and then if you bomb the school then you're responsible for the death of the children. Again, this is an accusation that Hamas denies. It argues that Hamas leaders have stolen donations, that billions of dollars from the Arab world were funneled into the Gaza Strip, but where's the money? Most people in Gaza are poor, and the leaders of Hamas are rich. Now, I don't know where the money comes from, but the part of the leaders of Hamas are rich is kind of true. The leader of Hamas right now, Khalid Mash'al, reportedly has $2.5 billion in his bank account. Now, where does someone who started as a refugee has $2.5 billion in his bank account? Or how does that happen? It's a good question. I don't know the answer. And of course they say Hamas is a constant threat to us because it publicly calls for the destruction of Israel and for killing more Jews. On the other side, of course, there are claims by Hamas that the Israeli siege on Gaza is illegal by international standards. That again, I've tried to look into this. It's a bit disputed. I guess it's the question of which international law expert you actually ask. They claim that because of the siege there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, that the provisions cannot come in or out, that the occupation in essence still continues despite Israeli presence, despite Israeli argument that Israel has left, and that because Israel is still occupying Palestinian lands elsewhere, such as in the West Bank, the conflict will continue. That is, we cannot separate Gaza from the West Bank, even if Israel left Gaza completely, opened up all the checkpoints and so on. So these are the basic principal arguments of both sides, and I think this would be a good place to stop. Right now there's ongoing negotiations for a long-term ceasefire, and we have to see how that's going to turn out. Actually, one last point that I want to make is about the role of the United States in all this, and maybe we can have discussion about this too. For some reason, it appears that the U.S. has the U.S. foreign policy has constantly failed to understand how the Middle East works. And we see this time and again. For instance, in the early 1950s, the major Aswan Dam project in Egypt, U.S. was supposed to fund it, and then the United States decided not to fund it, and the Egyptians went with the Russians, and that's how we got 30-something years of Egypt being on the Soviet side in the Cold War instead of the U.S. side, for instance. Or the U.S. backing up the Shah of Iran in the 1970s, a ruthless dictator, and that's probably one of the reasons why there were so very strong anti-American sentiments in Iran that accompanied the Islamic Revolution there in 1979. Or the war in Iraq in 2003, where we basically just had a dictator, yes, Saddam Hussein, but there were hundreds of other dictators all over the world. And the real question is, since he obviously was not a big threat as we used to think, what would have happened if we just let this guy stick around? Definitely none of this sectarian violence and everything we get now, so was it really a good idea to go there and remove him so some people could sell weapons and make a lot of money? And the same thing we could say about the Syrian case. The Obama administration publicly called Assad to resign from the very beginning of the demonstrations against him in 2011. To which Assad responded many times, "You guys have no idea what you're talking about. You really want me to leave. If I leave, you're going to get Al-Qaeda instead." And he kind of was right. The question I keep asking myself, and now that's really where I'm going to end, is how come the Russians keep understanding the situation a lot better than we do, time and again and again? And I don't have a very good answer for it, but maybe somebody does. So that's where I'll stop, and now I'll be happy to take your questions. Thank you. Yes.
Uh,
Maybe you should stand up though, because I guess that's the rule.
Okay, all right. First of all, I think I speak for everyone when I say I'd like to thank you for speaking on the subject today that is very salient and has global implications.
Thank you.
My name is Mike Jamia. I'm a secondary education major here at Ball State. I'm majoring in secondary education here.
Okay.
I aspire to teach history, government, and sociology. So all fields have some relevance towards this issue.
Okay.
So my question is in regards to education.
Okay.
How would you recommend young secondary teachers to teach this subject and educate young adults on the conflict in the Middle East with objectivity and sincerity?
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you. I think, first of all, that we have to realize the best way to start doing this is to realize that there is no such thing as being completely objective. And there's no such thing because all of us have some views on this issue. I've struggled with this question quite a bit because I teach the Arab-Israeli conflict and I grew up in Israel. And so my question, the question that I always ask myself is, how do I make my students who have many, many issues with Israel on various levels feel comfortable in my class? How do they not, and I know I'm talking about college students, but I think the same thing applies for secondary teaching, okay? How do you do this? I think the first thing, as you said about sincerity, you have to be honest. And you have to come to your students and say, look, this is where I'm coming from. I'm going to tell you where I'm coming from because I want you to know what's the agenda here, so you won't feel this guy's talking out of some unknown, hidden agenda that I can't figure out. So everything is on the table. This is me, this is where I grew up, this is what I believe in, here are my politics. I say this on day one. I don't do it almost anywhere else, but I think with this sensitive topic, it's very important to do that. So I say this, and then I say, and now I'm going to teach you this class as if I never actually told you what I just did. And you'll be the judges whether I managed to be objective or not. Now, there's no such thing as complete objectivity. When we talk about the Middle East, I think the most important part is that we need to really work hard, despite our own personal beliefs, to be able to see the other side. And it's not always easy, because there are a lot of emotions involved, and if you come from the Middle East, many people from the Middle East have had or known relatives or friends who were directly influenced by this conflict, or even killed. So it's charged emotionally, the issue itself. And yet, if you're a real professional, you need to step beyond those personal emotions and problems and be able to look at it and say, for instance, in the case of the Arab-Israeli conflict, we really have two competing narratives here. And I'm not going to tell you which of them is better than the other. I'm not going to do that first because personally, to be honest, I'm not really sure which of the narratives is better than the other. But because academically, I'm not the one to judge. You need to have all the information and you make up your own opinion. So the right way to do this is really to try to talk about there are two competing narratives. In Iraq, there are probably more than two competing narratives. In Syria, there are like 15 competing narratives. We can't teach all 15, unfortunately. But I think really that's the way to go about this. And again, no teacher is perfect, and no class on the Middle East is the same anywhere. Unfortunately, I know quite a few teachers who inject a lot more of their own politics into the classroom when they teach this topic. And I think that's not good, not because this is not elementary school, and I feel fine talking about my own personal beliefs, but you have to create an atmosphere, and it's even more important in high school, where people feel that they can talk about their own emotions and their own feelings about this topic without being criticized by others. You have to create this safe environment, and as a teacher, the only way for you to do this is to really say everything is welcome, all perspectives are welcome, and we really have to listen to somebody else. On the grand scheme of things, I really think that this is one thing that we're missing. I've had a lot of debates with people who, some agreed with me and some not, but as an Israeli, I had a lot of debates with Arabs this past summer. And in fact, I went all the way to have debates in Arabic on Facebook with Arabs from the Arab world that I don't even know, academics who work in universities all over the Arab world, who never actually had a discussion with an Israeli, which is why it was important for me to post in Arabic and not in English, so everyone reads it. And my conclusion is that I'm happy that they heard what I had to say and I heard what they had to say, but it's as if we were living in two completely different worlds. There was no I'm not saying agree with me, even though it was very hard even to see the other side. Like to even understand, do you understand why I think this group is a terrorist group and you don't? I understand that you don't, but can you see why I think that they are? And I think that's what we really need to work on. The ability to see the other side without agreeing with the other side. Just the ability to see it and say, you know what, I understand now that there are people on the other side who just have a different take than myself on the issue. That's the big challenge of teachers, and hopefully I'll figure out the best way to do it at some point down the road. Thank you. Yes? Yeah?
I guess I have to ask, you talked about American involvement. I guess I would have to ask, what factor do you think that plays? What amount does it play in stoking the flames? I know you have like Chomsky, and Chomsky has this strong belief that had the United States never fucked anyone and gone in and raised hell, nothing would have happened. Had we not backed Israel and still continued to build the Iron Dome and had 1,500 Israelis died instead of 1,500 Palestinians this summer, Israel would never go to fight Gaza the way they do. They would relieve some of the tensions. Had we never backed Saddam Hussein and then gone back and deposed him, we would have never created a conflict there that would have not only created distrust of Americans in Iraq, but also created a situation where there is no way to gain that trust back. We've proved to be whimsical, and we've proved to be shaky allies at best. And
that's him, not you.
That's Chomsky, yes.
Okay. All right.
I just wonder, and my question truly is,
okay,
what level does that involvement, what level does that changing alliances that we have to try to protect our strategic interests, how much does that affect that, and how much violence are we causing?
Well, I think there's no agreement even in the United States what are these strategic interests really, right? So, but to answer your question, I don't know, as a historian I don't really like to speculate about what would have happened if something else happened. I mean, anything could have happened, who knows? Has the US made mistakes? Clearly, I mean, there's some places where it's pretty obvious. I think in the question of Iraq and removing Saddam Hussein, I think many Iraqis now miss the days of Saddam Hussein because at least then they could get up in the morning and go to work. Yes, they could not engage in politics and they could not challenge the regime, but they could get up in the morning, go to work, no one cared if they drank alcohol, and they could go back home and you know, put their kids to sleep and not fear that something's going to blow up next to their building. And I think that's much better than the current situation. I think many people now in Syria who are under the rule of the Islamic State, they didn't like Assad too much, but they'll take Assad any day now over these Islamic State people. And has the U.S. played a role in this? I think probably so, some role. I mean, you could come up with the argument that these guys would have emerged somehow and ousted Saddam Hussein without the U.S. involvement. It's possible, as I said, I can't speculate on what would have happened. I think we should recognize that sometimes we've failed to see and understand the Middle East. My speculation for the question that I asked at the end of my presentation is that the Russians, their political culture is a lot closer to the political culture in the Middle East than ours. And that's why many times they understand the Middle East better than we do. But again, this is my speculation. I'm not sure that this would be the correct assessment. And so, what can I say? It's hard to answer this question. I think in the case of Israel and Palestine, there's no doubt that U.S. support for Israel has alienated many Arabs and many Muslims. It's obvious, it's been stated many times. There are many studies on this question. In fact, Americans and Middle Easterners were really great friends in the 19th century and all the way up to the beginning of the Cold War, and then something changed. And the main thing that changed was the creation of Israel and the U.S. support for it. But of course the question is, could have the United States supported Israel and yet not alienate so many Arab politicians and Arabs and Muslims in general? I think probably yes, but I wouldn't know how to do this because I'm not a political strategist and I'm pretty lousy at politics anyways. So I wouldn't know.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Yes?
No question.
Questions? No. Yes?
Thanks for the presentation. It seems like intentionally or otherwise, you kind of misled some of the pictures when you talk about.
Please correct me.
If it's debatable, it's an occupied state. It's the largest prison in the whole world. There's nothing debatable about that.
That's not the part that's debatable. I agree with you about that. That's not the debatable part.
You talk about Hamas took position in a coup in 06. There was an election. President Carter was there to oversee and it was a proper election. There was no coup.
That's in 2006. In 2007, Hamas took over by force the Gaza Strip.
Well,
Look it up.
they were alienated the minute they were elected.
Indeed,
Israel
that's
said
true.
we have no one to talk peace with.
You are right.
And the U.S. follows suit. They always do what Israel tells them to do.
That's true also. I did not take sides on this. Everything you're saying, except the issue of the coup, is correct, but I did not take any side. I mentioned the basic fact that in 2006, I did not mention the elections, and you're right, I should have. In 2006, there were elections in the Palestinian Authority, and indeed Hamas won the elections and had the majority of seats in the Palestinian parliament. So thanks for the opportunity to correct this. It is also true, as you've noted, that Israel decided not to have any relations or communications with members of parliament from Hamas or members of the Palestinian government from Hamas. This is also true, and that led to, as you said, alienation of that group. Now, what's debatable is we can argue if that justifies taking the Gaza Strip by force or not. I don't really know, but the fact is that this is what happened in 2007. And the other question we have to ask ourselves, and again, this is a question that I don't really know the solution for, and I'm not taking a side because I don't have one, is whether it is fine for a group like Hamas to say we reject Israel, we want to see Israel destroyed, but also to say, yet Israel has to open up the siege on Gaza. Because essentially what we get is, as you have rightly noted, an open prison. People can't leave, they can't go. In the last operation, we've seen it very clearly, right? There were invitations for Palestinians to leave their homes because the homes were about to be bombed, right? And then their issue is, where are these people going to go? Because they can't leave the Gaza Strip, and their homes are destroyed, and they have nowhere else to go. They went to the UN compound, and then in one or two cases, Israel bombed those UN compounds too. But the real question is, if you have an entity that governs an area and publicly calls for your destruction, are you still expected to keep open borders with that entity? I'm not taking sides here. I'm saying that's another question that ought to be asked, because I'm a great believer that we need to see different sides of this. And this conflict, as hard as it is for us to acknowledge, has more than one side to it. It is true, indeed, that the Palestinians have been the greater sufferers of this conflict, that they have been the occupied people, whereas Israel is the occupier. I'm not denying any of that. All I'm saying is that there is more than one side to the story, and all I'm hoping that people would do was acknowledge that there is another side. Never said you actually have to agree with the other side. But if you can even bring yourself to see that some people are thinking differently, and why are they thinking differently about this, then we've done something. And maybe one day we can be really good friends, who knows?
If I may follow up on this.
Please do.
Whatever Hamas says, just a charter, just talk. They are never equal with the government, with the state, with the military, with the superpower of Israel. So if they say, it's a wish. It's a wish. It's fine. I wish I had hair. But it's a wish. You cannot hold them for that and say, okay, we're not going to talk with you. We're not going to allow you to live. I mean, the response that Palestinians received from Israel was total destruction. I mean, it's complete rebel.
Indeed.
So, I mean, we are overlooking the fact that Israel continues to expand against all UN charters and resolutions. Every single president, starting from '76, that's when I came to America, he said all these settlements are illegal, an obstacle to peace. But what do? We play both sides of the line. We fund it at the same time. You know, in my opinion, Israel is not our friend, and the U.S. ought to quit giving our money away.
No, that's a legitimate opinion, and you know, I'm not going to argue with you about the opinion itself. What you said in general about settlements is, you know, it's. I mean, I showed you the map of settlements, so you know what I think about this already. And so, look, I think the Israeli perspective, again, not my personal perspective, the perspective of the Israeli government is, it's true. Hamas has wishes and cannot carry them out, and let's make sure they'll never be able to carry them out. So we'd rather see these guys destroyed than being able to carry out their dreams. This is, again, not my opinion, this is the current Israeli government stand on it. So, everything else you referred to with respect to destruction and colonizing more land and all that, this is a well-known story. And, you know, the one thing that I kept saying to my Arab friends that I had discussions with is that you keep telling me the same things. They said the same things that you just said when I talked about Hamas. They said the exact same things. And I said, you know what? Here's what I would want to see one day. I, as someone who grew up in Israel, even though I've been in America for many years, I can easily see all of the problems that you're talking about. I'm not avoiding them. I'm not escaping them. I'm not telling you that you are wrong and that you know, all of the land of Israel belongs to us and you guys should go someplace else. I'm not doing that. I acknowledge the problems that exist. And then I say, well, how about don't be equal to me in acknowledging the problems on your side. Just a little bit. Just be able to speak honestly and say, you know, we did some things wrong too in this conflict, just so we'll get a little tiny step closer to each other. Because that's really my hope. This has happened with some people, not with everyone. But, you know, as I said, I'm a big believer eventually of ongoing debate and conversation. And that's where I think things should go. But thank you very much for your comments. Yes?
I'd like to make a comment concerning, you made some good points, and I'm Israeli myself, but you're asking the wrong person. Politicians should be asked. They make history. This gentleman just tells the history, not the answers. So I hate to see that mistake here, because it will only tell you what is happening, not what might happen or should happen. And I agree with some of the stuff you said.
Yes?
Question. You mentioned about the human shield in Gaza and saying that Hamas is using humans, but if the...
I said these are the Israeli claims. I didn't say that. Yeah, okay.
If the Hamas came from the democratic election and is recognized as a government by the Gaza citizens, it means all the schools, all the public buildings in Gaza is actually governmental of Hamas, owned by Hamas. So like there's question, the statement of human shield is kind of irrelevant. Any school, any hospital, home means you're shooting the governmental actually buildings, which belongs to democratically elected Hamas party. So like this is what I want to make a clarification. Like human shielding, the concept of human shielding is so irrelevant over here. Like, don't you agree with me on this side?
Well, yes and no. First of all, Hamas was not democratically elected to run Gaza. They took it over by force. That's well documented. There's no question about that. As with respect to human shields, again, I agree with you. It's debatable. But to say it's completely irrelevant. Look, there are well-documented cases of Hamas fighters shooting rockets from within schools and hospitals. You can call them government buildings, but I think that if you shoot a rocket from a schoolyard, then you're irresponsible, because the next thing that's going to happen, you have a homemade rocket. Israel has a half-ton bomb that's going to completely destroy the school. You can say it's not a proportional response and all that, and that would be fair and fine, of course. But if that happens, and this half-ton bomb falls on the school, then the big question is, sure, Israel destroyed the school, but was it the right move on your part to shoot a rocket from a schoolyard? And if you really care about the lives of those children, would you actually do that? Is that the right thing to do? Again, these are questions I am not sure I have the answers. The one thing that I have seen, because I like to be very suspicious of what I see on either Palestinian or Israeli media, because I know it's biased, and I know that they have an interest to show certain things. On Israeli media, you'll see shooting rockets from schools, and on Palestinian media you won't, and so on. But foreign journalists who tend to be, especially European ones, who are more pro-Palestinian than pro-Israeli, and are stationed in Gaza, when they film Hamas people shooting rockets from within a street full of women and children, I'm sorry, that's to me proof that they're actually doing that. I think it's irresponsible on their part, if they cared about their own people. That's it. But I think that's part of a major cultural difference that perhaps we need to understand. The leaders of Hamas couldn't care less about most of the people in Gaza. All they want to do is get rich, and they have managed to get rich. And of course, they're enjoying a lot of support from the people of Gaza right now because they fought a heroic war against Israel. And that makes sense right now. But people have to ask themselves, what do we really want down the road? Do we want to continue fighting? Yes. As you over there have outlined, the Palestinians are the weak side. They're no match for Israel. So you continue to fight. More of your people are going to die. Or should we actually start talking? Now, I know the immediate response would be, but the Israeli government doesn't really want to talk. And that's also true, and that's why we're stuck in this problem. You see, because we have two sides who don't really think too much about the future of their own people. Because if you think of it from the Israeli perspective, the less you negotiate and the more settlements you build, yeah, it's bad for the Palestinians, but it's much worse for Israel. It creates worse scenarios for Israel, international boycott, and eventually we'll have a one state with a majority of Arabs, and the dream to have a Jewish state will no longer be around or be relevant. So it's not even good for Israelis, let alone the Palestinians. In other words, we have leaders on both sides who care a lot about themselves, not too much about the people they claim to represent, and that's one of the major problems we have. That's the way I see it. You have a follow-up on that? Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah, so the thing is, you're right about that Hamas doesn't recognize the state of Israel as a state. But one point that here media doesn't cover that under the international laws, if one state recognizes other state, it means like to recognize all its territory, including the occupied land, including the Jewish settlement, which is illegal built in the Palestinian land. So Hamas recognizing Israel means it recognizes Israel with illegal occupied lands. That's why Hamas says we don't want to recognize Israel. So it's...
I'm not sure though, because Fatah recognizes Israel and they yet don't recognize...
That's why the Hamas doesn't agree with Fatah too, because like they're calling them cheaters of easily giving the land to Israelis and stuff.
Okay.
But the thing is like, that's why like over here, like Hamas is being criticized. However, they're also making point. They're saying if they're coming back to the 1967 border by UN resolution, even Hamas says we are ready to recognize Israel. However, they need to take up from the occupied lands.
This is a new position,
Hamas,
by the way.
Being recognized as a terrorist organization, are saying we are ready to recognize Israel under the 1967 UN resolution border.
Yes, and that is a very recent development, in fact. What you just outlined right now, you're absolutely correct. This is a recent development of the last few weeks. We started hearing Hamas leaders saying, you know what, we're willing to talk about 1967 because until this operation and until this summer, their position was 1967 in exchange for a long-term ceasefire and not anything more. We'll never recognize Israel. Now we start hearing some voices within Hamas saying, maybe we need to think of ourselves and the bigger project, which should be a Palestinian state. Okay, it's still too early to tell what will come of this. And we still have a government within Israel that is not really willing to make any meaningful concessions at this point. So right now we're just talking about statements. I don't think there's anything meaningful that's going to come out of it. And that's, of course, very sad, but that's just the way it is. Yes?
Do you find that even in this room, do you find that there's any evolution of Arabs who are accepting Israel as a state? as you have conversations with Arabs in this room and elsewhere, you find that Arabs are saying, yes, I think Israel should exist as a state?
Well, first of all, I have many Arab friends who don't, in principle, have any problem with Israel existing.
But I'm asking you, do you find people say, yes, Israel should exist as a state? Is there any
You're asking as a
evolution?
state or as a Jewish state?
I'm asking you. Say yes or no. I mean,
If the question is if there are Arabs who recognize the right of Israel to exist as a state, the answer is yes. I know quite a few of them. Is that your question? If you're asking about this room, I'm sorry, I cannot judge the positions of people in this room based on a few
Well,
back and forth questions.
is there any evolution in the last 30 years in your view of Arabs saying, yes, we now believe that Israel should exist as a state?
Yes, there is a very big evolution in this.
That's what I was trying to get you to say.
Well, then I've said it. I believe there is a big evolution, and one way to see this is, of course, the Saudi Peace Initiative from 2002. And that's a big, I didn't mention it here, in 2002, in the Arab Peace Summit in Beirut, the Arab League came and said, and it was a Saudi initiative, which all the member states of the Arab League accepted. And they said, if Israel withdraws to the 1967 borders and allows the creation of a Palestinian state whose border would be in East Jerusalem, and reach an agreeable solution to the refugee problem, and I stress this because that part is important, then we will recognize Israel and accept it as a nation among the Middle Eastern nations. And the part about the refugee problem is very, very important because you asked about evolution in the mindset. And up to this point, the Arab League's position was Israel has to allow all the refugees to return. In 2002, the language changed, and now it says an agreeable resolution between Israelis and Palestinians, meaning if Israel reaches an agreeable solution with Palestinians in the future, by which some are allowed to return, some get compensation, some become citizens of the countries where they've been living, that's agreeable to us, whatever the Palestinians agree. In other words, we are willing to go beyond 1948, leave 48 behind us, and move on and just talk about 1967 and accept Israel if it meets those conditions. And I think that was a big step. Unfortunately, nothing has happened with that yet, but in the last convention of the Arab League, they affirmed that this initiative is still on the table if Israel is interested. So, who knows? We'll see how it goes. But the answer to me is yes, there has been an evolution in the Arab position. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment regarding what you said about the so-called elections that come up to one in the last decade. No one will argue that 1933, the Nazis won also in the democratic election. No one will say that otherwise that they were far from being any kind of democratic regime. It was a fanatic dictatorship as well. So the fact that someone wins in democratic election doesn't make a democratic regime or make a democratic society. Only the last operation itself, the Hamas regime executed more than, I will say, 35 Palestinians that kind of oppressed or object their regime and their action during the war itself. So it's not a legitimate claim to me. It is a fact, but you have to consider a lot of facts that happened after 2006.
Yes?
I have a question about Islamic State because they claim to recreate the days of the classical caliphs. But when I think of classical Islam, I think of toleration of Judaism and Christianity. I think of the fact that the Yazidis are still here because even Zoroastrians could gain some toleration. That classical Islam was a very open culture in a number of ways.
Yeah.
So based upon what Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger did with the invention of tradition, how have you delved into how they are inventing their own version of classical Islam or the caliphs of old? Because it's not what I've read about the caliphs of old.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. This is a question that has been, I've been thinking about it quite a bit, and in fact, in my History 150 class today, we talked about this a little bit. There's a tendency of religions in human history to reinvent themselves and then tell their followers that this is how we used to do things in the past, even though we never used to do things that way. And the way they manage to market this is by ignorance, of course. If you make sure that people don't learn, then they can't challenge what you're telling them. The early caliphate was a very open society. You could do many things, and unless you got into trouble with the authorities, then you would be fine. And in fact, there's this great story about, this is not the early caliphate, the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun, who ruled in he died in 833, and one of his advisors asked him, who do you think is the happy subject of your empire? And he responded, the happy subject of the empire is the one who doesn't know me and I don't know him. And that's really how things went at the time in that empire. And it's very different from the Islamic State now, where they have people on the streets patrolling all the time, checking how you dress and for how much money you sell your merchandise, and whether you've been to the Friday prayer. But most of these people are not learned enough in Islamic history to be able to tell this is not how it used to be. By the way, religions do it today, of course, to a much lesser degree. We see it in the Christian world today with all sorts of new ideas that are introduced, even in Christianity in America, that people believe we must do this because we're Christians. Go back and check. The issue does not appear in the Old or New Testament. No Christian leader has ever spoken about it until the 20th century. And yet, we believe that we do this because we're Christians, because that's what we're told. I think religions do this time and again, and that's kind of a survival mechanism, if you wish. And I think that's what these guys are doing. That's my interpretation, anyways. All right. Well, thank you very much.